I've learned that being forgotten doesn't always come with fanfare. It can arrive like a silent update you were never asked to approve. The subject line read, Mandatory Leadership Sync, Room 2B900 AM. I opened it twice. Heather's tone was bubbly, clipped with emojis all lowercase charm. I scanned the invite list once, then again. My name wasn't there. The language was familiar. Some of the phrasing had come from a draft I'd written 3 weeks earlier, paragraph 3, where we outlined data retention flows for external audit prep. She'd kept the structure, even the comma placement. But the credit, like the meeting, had moved on without me. I checked the system calendar, the internal dashboard, the team tracker. Access restricted blinked across the check-in tool where my name used to autofill. A screen that once recognized me now offered nothing. Katie Summers passed my desk quietly, holding a binder too heavy for her frame. She stopped, shifted her weight, glanced at my screen. "Are you not going in?" I didn't answer right away, just turned off the display. She stood for a moment longer, then walked on. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead the same way they always did. No urgency, no alarms. I opened the shared inbox. Dozens of threads. I filtered by name, Collins Hastings Mercer, then by attachment. The memo was there. All staff with policy access credentials must attend. My credential level hadn't changed. The clearance tag was still affixed to my digital ID. But someone somewhere had made a choice. I sipped the coffee left on my desk from earlier, still warm, a little burnt. The ring it left on my coaster had gone dark at the edges. A passing voice floated in from the corridor. She tends to make things feel heavier than they are. It wasn't meant to be heard. That made it worse. I walked down the hall slowly past the framed poster of core values, past the marketing pod, where no one looked up. At the end, room 2B stood with its glass wall and fake fern beside the door. Inside, Heather dug Mindy. Even Mark was there, nodding, not leading. Not a single face turned, not a gesture, not even the polite reflex of acknowledgement. They'd all moved 1 seat forward, 1 seat over, 1 seat without me. I stood still, watching words form behind frosted panes. I didn't knock. There was no sound, only the vague hum of HVAC, and my own silence louder than I expected. I used to think the more seamless my work became, the more secure my place would be. The early morning started with the green light blinking on the data lockout panel. I used to come in before the cleaners had finished, jacket still folded in my lap, screens still cooling from the night before. No one asked me to. I knew where the risk logs bottlenecked. I knew where the mistakes liked to hide. Mark once left a segment of the federal compliance ladder mislabeled. I corrected it before the file reached legal. He never noticed, only remarked a week later that the brief ran unusually smooth this time. I nodded. That was enough. The coffee in the break room brewed thin during those hours. Still, I poured a cup, sipped it next to the terminal, while the clearance queues unfroze. My badge clicked into the system like a key, quiet and precise. The highest tier black core authorization sat inside a small vinyl sleeve in my drawer. I never displayed it, never brought it up. You work like no one's watching, someone once said over lunch. I think it was Mindy. You could at least pretend to have fun. I kept my response to a nod. On Fridays, they wore pastel cardigans and posted group photos. I stayed in charcoal grey and checked for data drifts between air gaps. The DSS certification took 4 months. Background checks, interviews, a surprise inspection where 2 men in windbreakers examined my router and asked about the frequency of firmware resets. I passed. No one at the office knew. I submitted the documentation silently scanned into the secure drop, as protocol dictated. When Heather presented her quarterly roadmap to the board, she used my formatting. Even my typo correction in slide 7 and extra space after integrity was still there. Great work, Kelly. She smiled as she closed the deck. You really brought this together. I watched Kelly blink, then smile back. She glanced at me afterward in the hallway. Not apologetically. Just as acknowledgement. A nod that didn't quite reach her eyes. I returned to my desk. The corner of my nameplate had peeled from the surface again, curling up like paper under heat. I pressed it back down with a strip of tape from the drawer, smoothed it flat. Some things stay in place better when no one else tries to fix them. I used to think being useful would be enough to keep me visible. The first time I noticed it, there was a stack of envelopes left at each desk, small cards with the company's gold crest pressed into the flap. Doug Mercer's signature was printed inside alongside a typed note of thanks. Mine said, "To the compliance team." No name. No signature. Just a generic message and a pen mark that stopped short of real handwriting. The second time I watched Doug in a quarterly meeting as he held up a report 70 pages color-coded, footnoted, cross-referenced line by line. He shook his head with a chuckle. That's got to be the longest audit brief I've seen. Good work, Mindy. She blinked once and smiled like she'd earned it. The copy in his hand still had my margin marks. My header, even my handwriting on page 2. The third came quieter. I'd submitted a model for layered access control's internal stratification to segment federal contract metadata. The document had been reviewed, approved, filed. Heather forwarded it to legal with a one-line note. Please review Susan's new framework. Could be useful next quarter. I didn't reply. I watched the trail vanish just like the others. One entry in the archive, but no path back to the source. I started recording them, not out of bitterness, just for clarity. A line in the corner of a notebook just above the spine. July 12th. Mindy, audit brief. August 8th, compliance team card. September 2nd, Susan, layered framework. I didn't keep track of reactions, only silence. That was what repeated. Once during a team lunch, someone laughed when I corrected a security term in passing. You really can't let things go, can you? Their fork hovered over the last bite of pie, tone light but sharp. You're like a walking footnote. No one disagreed. I sipped water and folded my napkin back into a square. The badge never changed. It sat in my wallet behind my transit card and a folded receipt. The black core chip embedded in it reflected nothing. No one ever asked what level I held. They just assumed I followed orders. I opened the notebook again last week. One page held only 4 words. Right doesn't mean seen. I traced the edge of the cover with my thumb and didn't write anything else. I've noticed that the smallest things often carry the heaviest consequences, especially when someone needs a reason to make you disappear. Heather stood just past the corner of the copier bay, arms folded like the space itself had been reserved for confrontation. Her tone was even rehearsed. Patterned fabric. Sarah. It's not aligned with the updated policy. The pants were slate wool smoothed to the touch, with a barely there diagonal weave I'd worn for years. Nothing flamboyant. Nothing new. I looked down at the seam fingers grazing the line that had once been hemmed by hand. Mindy stood just behind her, smiling, like she was watching a correction being made. It's about cohesion. She offered too bright. Traditional weaves only section 14. You read the update right. I didn't look at her. Section 16 of the Federal Compliance Statute supersedes internal aesthetic guidelines for any personnel holding federal clearance. which I do. Heather blinked. That's not really the point. It usually isn't. Movement behind them. Mark walked past, saw the stillness in my posture, the angles in Heather's stance. His gaze didn't stay. He turned right instead of left toward the stairs. No one else said anything. Kelly typed louder. Ryan adjusted his chair without looking up. Heather gave a breath through her nose like she'd just stepped into something she couldn't wash off. You're being combative again. It's becoming a pattern. I opened my inbox. A calendar request sat waiting. Room 3C HR review. 3:15 p.m. No subject line. No context. Just time and place. I clicked accepted. Nothing else. Inside the room, the air felt scrubbed. Heather sat straight. Mindy held a folder in both hands like it might bite. Doug didn't speak at first. This is a formality, Heather began. A consistent disregard for policy. Undermining tone. Appearance misalignment. We're terminating your employment effective immediately. The word misalignment sat alone on the second page of the notice. I scanned it slowly. No mention of DSS, no line about clearance, just a cluster of phrases, culture optics, team image. Doug cleared his throat. You've been given multiple chances. It's not personal. I folded the paper in half. So it's fabric. That's what we're doing. Heather smiled like someone placing a final stamp on a file. Sometimes leadership means enforcing things others overlook. I didn't reply. I reached for my bag, pulled out the black badge, and slid it into its signal-blocking envelope. The seal clicked. It sounded louder than it should have. I never understood how silence could feel so physical, until it filled a room meant to erase me. The box Kyle handed over was smaller than expected. One flap already bent, one side caved inward. He didn't speak, just placed it on the desk like a delivery he didn't want to claim. I packed slowly. The framed photo of a canyon trail, the legal pad with tabs in 3 shades of blue, a dried-out marker I kept, because it still left faint lines if pressed just right. Each item fit without resistance. Katie hovered by the copier, her voice barely carried. I didn't think they'd actually do it. I didn't answer. She left before I reached for the second drawer. The cactus had recovered. Last year it went soft from overwatering. Mindy, uninvited, thought it looked thirsty. I'd repotted it in gravel, let it sit near filtered light for months without comment. Now, one arm pointed upward again. I wrapped the base in a napkin and nestled it beside my stapler. Lynn looked up briefly as I passed her desk. Ryan leaned back in his chair, but didn't follow my movement. Their screens became shields. Outside the glass wall of the conference room I paused. The lights cast long reflections. Inside, Doug pretended to scroll through a document. Mindy held her pen like a gavel. Heather sat upright, spine like a ruler. None of them turned. I opened the door halfway, just enough to let the air change. You just fired the only person in this building who knew how to keep your government contract from collapsing. No reply. Heather blinked, one mouth slightly open. Doug adjusted his collar. I closed the door gently behind me. At the front, the receptionist pretended to staple something. Kyle signed a form without reading it. No one met my eyes. The wind outside pulled at the hem of my coat as I stepped onto the concrete. The sound of traffic beyond the hedge felt distant, like something happening in another version of the day. Inside my bag, the badge rested in its sealed sleeve aphid mesh, wrapped tight, invisible weight against the lining. I stood for a while watching the glass ripple with sun. Behind it, the company still breathed oblivious. Not wounded, not wise. Not yet. I never expected silence to feel structured, but there it was, stacked, sorted, and without seams. The kettle hissed before the water boiled. A small dent near the base caught the light, barely visible unless you were looking. I hadn't replaced it. It still poured clean. The mug was chipped. Not new. Just familiar. A white rim worn down to ceramic grey where my thumb had rested too often. I filled it slowly, watching the steam rise, swirl against the blinds. The laptop screen pulsed gently from sleep. I tapped the trackpad. A red banner blinked across the top corner. DSS protocol check-in missed. Clearance lock pending. Timer expired 12 hours ago. The system had already escalated. I didn't dismiss the alert. I didn't reply. The files sat open in nested tabs, subcontracts, encryption schemas, tiered access trees. My notes, still color-coded, margin-marked. I scrolled through them like walking through a room I no longer owned, but still remembered how to lock. There had been a form I'd once drafted to track policy deviation lines crossed, hand-written in ink too dark for comfort. I found it at the back of the old notebook. The last entries were neat. Bottom, Oct 2. Delegated clearance without trace. Inshorten, Oct 10. Altered version control labels. Oct 14. Denied audit trail, then redirected to comms. The paper smelled faintly of toner and lemon balm from an old spill. I closed the cover. No need to add more. My phone was still at 10%. I plugged it in screen down. No calls, no outgoing. A voice echoed from somewhere old, still sharp enough to leave a line. You make everything more complicated than it needs to be. That had been from my father, 2 years ago, at Thanksgiving. Over a plate I hadn't asked for while my sister poured wine like the evening meant something. She doesn't know how to let go, he'd added as if I weren't in the room. I'd folded my napkin then, just like now. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the hard drive. Then a new banner appeared. External alert triggered. Clearance investigation initiated. No one had messaged me. No agent had called. I hadn't logged in. But somewhere a system had noticed, and that, finally, was enough. I've learned some systems don't fail with noise. They stall in stillness, and then collapse without ceremony. The front desk chair wasn't comfortable, but I sat without shifting. The package in my lap bore no return address, only a stamped seal deep-pressed into matte paper. I signed twice. The pen skipped on the second signature, and I didn't correct it. Across the atrium, the elevator doors opened with a low chime. Heather stepped out first. Doug followed one step behind, necktie loosened as if that might soften what had already hardened. Mindy trailed them, clipboard clutched like a shield. None of them saw me. Or, if they did, they decided not to. They spoke in hushed tones, heads low, eyes darting toward the glass-walled conference room. 2 federal agents stood inside Agent Whitmore, arms crossed, Agent Redding reviewing a tablet without blinking. Heather's voice clipped at the edge of hearing. She wasn't on the checklist. I assumed it would Doug cut her off not with volume, but with flatness. You assumed wrong. They said this falls under breach. Mindy's response barely registered. She's not even here anymore. My name hadn't left the system. They'd removed the desk, not the credentials. The alert would have triggered a cascade redacted files, still tied to an active ID unverified sign-off on encrypted segments, and no termination notice logged with DSS. The word for that wasn't error. It was escalation. Someone had pulled a thread they didn't recognize as structural. Heather stood near the security gate, arms folded, mouth tight. She always acted like she was above it. She built half those policies just to prove a point. Doug didn't respond. His shoes squeaked once on the tile. I sat with the envelope still resting across my palms. My badge was inside, unscanned, untouched. Yet, it was the reason they'd returned. Across the lobby, Agent Whitmore gestured toward the door. Doug hesitated before stepping through. Heather followed slower now. Mindy stayed behind. Her eyes landed on me for half a second. Not recognition, just recoil. She turned toward the hallway without a word. The agents hadn't asked for my presence yet. The system had. And sometimes that's louder. I smoothed the edge of the envelope with my thumb. No need to move, no need to speak. They had come back for the clearance, but not for the person who held it. I used to believe doors only opened if someone else turned the handle. Doug stood with his hands clasped, fingers twitching just enough to make the stillness uncomfortable. The room wasn't large, but he filled it with practiced authority. Not control, just the shape of it. "We made a mistake," he said. Voice flat, as if the words had been translated through several meetings before reaching me. "Let's make this right." He slid a folder across the table. New title, higher grade, retroactive reinstatement. 15% increase, he added, plus discretionary options. We'll announce it privately. I traced the edge of the folder with one finger, not opening it. "You're valuable. Always have been. No apology. Just evaluation." Agent Whitmore stood near the doorway. Her arms didn't move. She watched the exchange the way one watches a fuse approach the end of its line. "We're not here to reintegrate," she said. "We're here to transfer oversight. There's a difference." Doug flinched at that, but smiled anyway. "Of course, but if she chooses to return, we'd welcome that." He looked at me. "You belonged here." I didn't respond. I reached for my bag. The zipper caught slightly on the inner lining. Inside was a small envelope, cream cardstock, no logo, just a name and number in raised ink. You don't want to throw away a career over misunderstandings. Doug continued. "This is solvable." I held the card between my fingers. The weight of it wasn't much, but it pressed against something older. I thought of a morning last spring alone in the copy room while a print job sputtered out of toner. Heather walked in, paused, then smiled at the door instead of me. She likes to think details make her irreplaceable. It hadn't been loud. That wasn't the point. I placed the card back into the envelope, then into my coat. "The salary you can afford," I said, "wouldn't cover the cost of forgetting this." No one replied. Agent Whitmore gave a slight nod and stepped aside. I walked out, past the glass wall where Mindy had once taped up birthday flyers no one read, past the poster about workplace values curling at one corner. Outside the light had shifted, but the building remained unchanged. I didn't look back. Some places don't hold shape once you've seen through them. I've come to understand that finality doesn't always sound like a slam. Sometimes it arrives with the rustle of paper and a folded seal. The envelope was heavier than I expected, not by weight, but by composition. I chose the thick stock kind, the kind used for legal correspondence or condolences. I didn't write a return address. There wasn't one that felt appropriate. Inside, I placed the unsigned separation document, never dated, never agreed to. I hadn't touched it since that last meeting, but the crease had faded where I'd once considered pressing the pen down. Alongside it, a copy of the DSS letter. Stamped. Verified. "We confirm Ms. Sarah Givens is under evaluation for independent contract oversight related to federal compliance systems. Authority level intact. Nothing about apology. Just acknowledgement. The badge went in last, one corner chipped near the clip slot. The surface still reflected light, but not faces. I wrapped it in the page where my name had been crossed out in red. Not shredded. Just lined through like a correction in a system that didn't realize the error was upstream. The letter itself was short. I no longer belonged to any structure that required my silence to validate its noise. This notice is not resignation. It's removal of my presence, my consent, and my signature. I addressed it in blue ink. Carol Dwyer, Office of Internal Legal Affairs, RE Policy and Personnel File, 0981 SG. No flourish, no initials at the bottom. The last time I used that post office was 5 years ago, when I mailed my DSS clearance packet. The same clerk wasn't there anymore. The carpet had been replaced with tile, but the brass dropbox by the east wall remained its surface dulled by touch. Someone once told me endings feel cleaner when someone else closes the door for you. She just shuts down when things don't go her way, my mother said, once folding napkins at a family dinner I hadn't planned to attend. She was always more paper than person. I pressed the envelope into the slot, slowly, fingers lingering just long enough to feel it slip. No tracking number, no confirmation receipt, only the sound of something leaving for the last time, and nothing in my hands when I walked away. I no longer measure time by who expects me to show up. The kettle hissed faintly before the switch clicked off. The metal had dulled over the years, scratches from spoons, a dent from a fall that never got smoothed out. I kept it anyway. It never failed to boil. The cup I chose wasn't matching anything. White ceramic rim uneven. The printed words on the side had faded to soft grey. Trust but verify. The handle warmed slowly in my hand. I opened the window above the sink. Cool air slipped in, soft enough to move the edge of the notepad left open on the table. The proposal sat beneath it, uncreased, unsigned. A red tab marked the section on independent oversight clauses. I hadn't touched it since Tuesday. No deadline had been set. On the shelf by the bookcase, a photo frame leaned slightly backward. My sister and I, knees covered in grass stains, holding mismatched paper plates and blinking into sun. No one else was in the shot. I found it in a storage bin when I cleared out my mother's attic. It wasn't framed then, just stuck between tax folders. You don't have to make everything permanent to prove it happened, she once said, while flipping through a stack of college applications I'd already mailed. You're always trying to archive your own life. I didn't frame the picture to preserve anything. I framed it because I no longer needed to forget it. The phone sat untouched on the counter. No alerts, no unread banners. I hadn't muted it. I just stopped checking. If something important came through, it would wait. Or it wouldn't. The cactus in the corner had grown another arm curved toward the light. I hadn't watered it in weeks. Still it held shape. Still it stayed. No articles had been written. No public statements had been made. No one called to say you were right. They never would. That was fine. Doug likely moved on. Heather too. People like that always do the way smoke clears, but never admits it, once filled a room. I poured the tea slow and even. The steam curled past my face and rose toward the ceiling like something deciding to leave without ceremony. Outside, the light settled into the sidewalk. Not bright, not dim. The kind of day that didn't need an audience. I lifted the cup, held it still. No one has to look at me for it to be real.